Hey, this is Todd. Happy 4th of July, everybody. I've been on taking a little bit of a break this week on vacation. I'm up in the Berkshires. You see the forest around me. I'm at a place called Beartown State Park, enjoying the holiday. I was going to try to get a video out this week, and hopefully this will be that video. I had a lot of aborted attempts that I tried earlier in the week, but just things got in the way, and sometimes it's hard to get in the frame of doing these videos when you're doing all kinds of family stuff. Plus, I have no Wi-Fi, no broadband internet up here, so getting anything done online is a little bit wonky, doing everything on my phone. So it's a little bit of a mess, but here we are, and hopefully this will get to you today or maybe tomorrow. Anyway, I had posted a poll on Twitter the other day asking about how people like their wilderness. Didn't get a ton of votes, but it seemed like I think I ended up about 60-40. The question was, where do you put your wilderness? I've been doing a lot of things on hexcrawlings and videos about that, as I'm sure you're aware. And so, the question came up. I actually seen this on Reddit, somebody asking about their philosophy of the wilderness. And part of their question about the philosophy was, where exactly is it? Is it on these frontier areas, or is it somewhere else? And I think that the person who posted it, rightfully so, was finding some difficulty. How do you explain that to your players? Not so much in the sense of, okay, there's this frontier area, but depending on how your cultural mores, so to speak, the colonial undertones or overtones of the frontier wilderness, wherein from settled lands, adventurers are coming in and essentially pillaging it. If you want to take it, and maybe the best way you can think of it as Indiana Jones, maybe if you want to take it in the worst way, you're more like conquistadors. The local creatures don't really matter. You're in there to take what you can get out of these ruins, these areas, basically, taking that treasure and taking it back to civilization. Or you're going to go out and actually literally colonize the place, putting down your stronghold, building, taking a stretch of wilderness and essentially, civilizing it, right? So those can be troublesome, but that's not the only way that a wilderness can exist. Another, I think, trope for the wilderness is I always think of it in kind of the sort of Dark Ages chivalry, romantic Dark Ages sort of England, in which you have these sort of castles with the strongholds and the towns and villages surrounding it, and then all this kind of wilderness in between where you have all kinds of crazy stuff happening, where, the fairy presence and monsters and trolls and all these great things are going on in those sort of woods. All the forest areas are sort of dark and mystical and magical, druids and Merlin and all that in the woods, and then you have these pockets of civilization, kind of like, I guess, sort of like the points of light type system. And I think that was what I was going to spend a few minutes talking about today. I think, again, going back to that poll, I said, how do you like your wilderness? On the frontiers or, surrounding all these areas, all the settled areas? And I think it came back about 60-40 or 70-30 in favor of the frontier, which I understand has more of a history in the game. I think you go back to things like Keep on the Borderlands, and I think it's I forget, there's another module, something with a hill. I'll look it up when I get home. But there's a couple of those early modules that posit sort of these borders more or less, and then you're pushing on into the wilderness. But I think if you go back to Blackmoor and Greyhawk themselves, they were more in that points of light, in which you would find these little city centers or towns or villages, strongholds scattered throughout a map, and then in between there were these vast tracts of not necessarily unknown, because, again, back in the beginning they were using a map from outdoor survival, so you laying down that map, you see everything that's there, but what's actually obviously in those areas is more or less unknown, right? It's refilled from whatever deposits of creatures, wherever they come from, is constantly regenerated and refilled in there, and they're repopulating these areas where people aren't staying. So they may be coming through there, they may be going from town to town and taking the King's Road, but they're not hanging out there. And in those places where people aren't staying and leaving that imprint of civilization, you have the wilderness. So here in the Berkshires, it's a beautifully scenic area. It has, essentially, it's dotted with towns, and these little very, very cute, very scenic towns in the valleys. And through, I think, very good regional planning, they've left a lot of the hills and everything forested. I think it's an interesting thing because they've sort of reforested them. So I remember seeing I usually stay in Great Barrington, which is where some of my family is from. I remember one time when they had some anniversary, they had a town with photos showing the town back in, say, the early 1900s, and a lot of the hills that are now green were all deforested. But pretty early on, they recognized that a lot of the people coming to visit were interested in seeing the green, seeing the foliage. Fall is a big time when all the leaves change. Is a big time here. So they not only did they preserve a lot of the hills with the forest, they actually worked to take some of the ones that had been sort of stripped bald by people, and now they're green and verdant again. But I bring this up to say that on a sort of romantic, fantastic level, you can have easily where you have civilization, these towns and everything happening, and yet up in the hills, up in these forests that surround all of these townships, who knows what lurks in the woods and in the ponds and in the lakes and amongst the trees where people don't go. People stay to where the light, they stay within walking distance of their town or of their secluded cabin, and they don't go there. And I think those things can be just as viable wilderness as the vast frontiers. I think the one thing, if you're going to use this sort of idea that the wilderness pervades the spaces around settled lands, is where do creatures come from? If you're going to have vast tribes of monstrous humans, where do they come from? If you're looking at, say, Dark Ages, England, and it's an island, and yet we have these big pockets of wilderness, but they're all surrounded in different points by people, and then they're surrounded by the sea. So where are great goblin tribes coming from? Where are orcs raiding from? Where are giants raiding from? And I think one of the answers that I was like is using something like the Feywild or some other plane that, Tuatha De Danann, I guess, would be, in I think the Irish, sort of this land, this kind of fairy land where all these fantastic creatures that is like their original plane, and then through different doorways, portals, methods, end up in the material plane in our Dark Ages. I always like to think of it as, I think you see tales of this when you're talking about, say, the fairyland or the green circles and almost in a Twin Peaks way where the trees form arches, and those can function as doorways so that you don't have to have huge civilizations of orcs or goblins or kobolds right there. They can be in these other planes, and then when the moon is right, when the stars align, these shimmering portals come alive, and then maybe some of these troops, either they're pushed through or they come through to seek their fortune or try to recapture. I think a lot of the fairy tales, right, the fairies originally owned everything, and then they were slowly pushed out by humans. Well, maybe these different fairy tribes want to come back, and so they push back through these portals and try to take it back. So I think that's one way you can have sort of these pockets of dangerous, magical, mystical areas that are surrounded, in a sense, by civilized people. There's also the idea of glades that are protected, the idea of dryads and these sort of creatures, or kelpies and water horses, and all these different creatures that protect different elements of land and keep them wild. And that one of the reasons why these places can stay mystical and magical and untarnished by human or other, civilized hands, is that you have these creatures who have their eternal abodes there, and they don't abide by people coming. So water horses who will lure people to their ponds and lakes and then drown them, or dryads or other sort of fairy creatures of the trees who will protect their glades, or even things like druids who are sworn to protect their sacred woods. Unicorns. My daughter loves The Last Unicorn, and one of the big things there was these unicorns, when they're in the woods, they have their wood, and when a unicorn's there, you can't hunt there because you'll never catch anything. It won't be touched by the seasons or touched by, it'll stay, perfectly green and perfectly fertile. So you have all those forces too that can be in there, and of course, we're going back to the Feywild or some other plane. How do those forces get replenished when bad things do happen? You have these portals from different planets come over. And it can be something that evolves over time, because if you get rid of the unicorn who's guarding the woods, maybe something else can't get there to replace it. Maybe if the glade is desecrated enough that the portals to the Feywild or forever become broken. And that can be something that maybe it can be repaired, maybe it can't. If you have a party of people who are interested in preserving the wilderness, druids and rangers and whatnot, that can be an adventure for them in and of itself to repair some portal or to bring back a guardian spirit to woods that have gone bad, that have gone to rot, or have just been civilized, so to speak. If you're uncomfortable with the frontier area, or if it just doesn't float your boat, or you're just looking to do something different, I think the the idea of the pockets of darkness or pockets of mysticism and magic. I don't want to say it doesn't have to be dark, though often the tales and the magic tends to have a dark touch to it, but just the pockets of interesting, strange, untouched sort of virgin wilderness can be anywhere you want them to be, and you can figure out ways of making that happen, whether it's planar connections to places like the Feywild, whether it's pockets of strange magic that keep things preserved in a certain way, or guardians that are there who protect it, or a combination, all the above, I should say. I posted on Facebook a quote from the Golden Bow where I'm sorry, well, I posted one from the Golden Bow talking about a glade in which there was sort of a priesthood that was basically, you replace one priest by killing the one who came before you. So we talked about a priest who would be wandering this glade armed at all times, wary for the next priest who would come and assassinate them. But the one I meant to mention was one that came up from a book I'm reading about the fall of the Roman Republic, but it was talking about the Roman vision of Gaul, France, and it was talking about wilderness with just weird rituals around dark pools and just filled with blood and murder, and that's how they saw this sort of wilderness that was outside their frontier. And it's a really, you can look it up on Twitter. Hex Pressman. I'll try to, if I can remember, I'll dig up the link and throw it in the show notes. But it's just a really great, vivid little image of this idea of this wilderness that's kind of creepy and magical and evil, or if not evil necessarily, then hostile. Hostile, at least to them, they felt it was hostile. But those kind of things can exist everywhere. You can have all kinds of creepy pools and strange cults. I mean, D&D is full of cults and villages that have some kind of relationship with these cults and who keep some of these preserving forces alive. And what is the relationship between the village and the strange wood or grassland or swamp or whatever that is nearby? Is there some kind of interesting connection there? Is there kind of a Wicker Man thing going on? There's a lot of interesting stuff you can do with that, and something you can pepper your world with, really give it, if you don't want to have a set frontier with unknown area, an unknown wilderness, not necessarily unknown, but a untamed wilderness in front of you, then again, use these ideas and throw those pockets around your world. And there are things that your party can go in and explore, either to, if they are really bad and evil, then maybe the locals need help in there. Maybe there are ruins involved, and of course then there's loot and treasure and other things, or maybe there are things that your party's going to want to preserve. But there are a lot of ways to integrate that. So I just want to talk about that. I think that's about all I have to say for the moment, but that's the wilderness as far as being, pools of wilderness that are around the settled lands. I think there's a lot of options there. So when you're building that hexcrawl and the idea of having a large swath of just wilderness you don't find fits the view of your world that you have, then feel free to scatter it amongst the settled lands and game on. Anyhow, happy 4th. I will talk to you later.